Okay. All right. So, good afternoon by Jewish clock, evening by the secular clock. The sun is still well in the sky. It counts as afternoon as far as Judaism is concerned, but that's not the point of tonight's class. Tonight, we are actually going to look at some modern holidays that are coming up, and I wanted to give it to you now because we're going to go a while without having class. Right? So next week is the night before the night of Pesach, which means it's time for Bedikat Chametz, the search of your house for Chametz, and all those other last-minute preparation things you need to do before you have Passover. And then the following Thursday is the beginning of the end of Passover. So for those 2 weeks, we won't have classes. So we'll be meeting again. I always forget English numbers. We'll be meeting again in April on the 12th. So April 12th will be our next class. But I wanted to give you guys a heads up on some of the holidays that are happening right after Passover, because these are modern holidays. You're not going to find these in the Torah. You're not going to find these in Tanakh. You're not going to find these in the Mishnah. You're not going to find these in the Talmud. These are all holidays that came about in the 20th century. So let's see what we got. So the 20th century, we had to do all the history stuff first before I could explain these. The 20th century was a time of immense change for the whole world and, of course, for the Jewish people. We talked about the mass persecution in Europe, all the problems that happened, the anti-Semitism against the Jews, and how that drove the need to go back to the land of Israel or to leave to the United States or some other countries if people were not able to come to the U.S. Remembering that in the 1920s, the United States almost completely stopped immigration of Jews to this country because of anti-Semitism. They became extremely anti-Semitic during that time period. There was also massive upheaval, not upheaval, pardon my typo, in the Jewish communal life. We talked about how you have the Reform movement, and then you have the Orthodox movement, and then you have the Conservative movement, and later on you have Reconstructionism, and how people organized was also different. We're no longer living in only Jewish areas, which was unusual, but it was unusual for 500 years. Now we are living in suburbs, or we're living in cities that are totally built differently with these giant apartment buildings. Jewish life was restructuring during this time period. And of course, we have the mass murder in the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews were murdered, which was absolutely devastating to our people. But then you have the miraculous rebirth of Israel as a modern state, which, if anybody had gone back to 1848 and said 100 years from now, we will have a Jewish state that is independent and its own country in the Middle East, they would have called you a lunatic. Just absolutely impossible. All of these things have had an impact then on how we relate, how we think of us, our country, our people, God, and all of these things. This has been some of the most change really since 1492, when the Jews were pushed out of Spain and other parts. And that means that we've ended up celebrating and remembering in special ways. And it's been done through the auspices, under the influence of the modern state of Israel. So one of the benefits of having a modern Jewish state that is an actual government with Knesset, the parliament, and they're able to pass laws, is they can make decisions that the rest of us Jews will kind of listen to. I mean, they can't make a law for me, but if they make a holiday, I'm going to pay attention to the holiday that my Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel are making. So we've been sort of following their lead. And that means that we've got 3 days that have had the biggest impact. And those are Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaShoah. Those 3 days we're going to talk about in detail this afternoon. Yom Yerushalayim, we're not going to talk about because that is the day of Jerusalem. And it is has a different feel to it, because Yom Yerushalayim celebrates when in 1967 the city of Jerusalem was reunified, and when Jews were allowed to re-enter the old section of the city, and it became part of Israel's area of control. And although we do have special celebration within the conservative movement, and there are special celebrations, of course, in Israel. We're still figuring out what that all means. As if you watch the news, you can understand that. So we're not 100% sure how to celebrate that best, so it's still shaking out. Whereas these other three have now become very much on every calendar and in everybody's life, something that is observed around the Jewish world. So let's go through and do each of them. Yom Ha'atzmaut is the first holiday, but not the first in the cycle. It is actually the last holiday of the three. But it's the one we got to cover first, because without this one, the other ones don't happen. Yom Ha'atzmaut is Israel's Independence Day. It is on the 5th of Iyar, which in 1948 was May 14th. So we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut on the 5th of Iyar. Even though this was a secular holiday originally that was established by the state of Israel, they picked the day that was the Hebrew day rather than the secular day for the commemoration. And so that means every year you have to look into your Hebrew calendar and find when is the 5th of Iyar. That's easy for me because that's my birthday. So I always know when my birthday is on the Hebrew calendar because it's printed in every Hebrew calendar. So it's very convenient. Quick reminder, the UN vote of November 29th, which is actually my brother's birthday, outlined the establishment of the Jewish and Palestinian states in the British Mandate of Palestine. The British agreed, although they foresaw trouble, and said they would hand over control at midnight, May 14th, which was the 5th of Iyar. The Jewish groups agreed and declared independence. The Arab nations, which were primarily not living in the territory, they weren't actually in the area of Palestine, they were the surrounding countries, as we talked about, they declared war on May 15th. When Israel survived the initial war, they commemorated Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Day of Independence, annually after that, and turned it into a day of a full celebration. The same way in America that the 4th of July is our day of American independence. Lots happened before, lots happened since, but just like in America, you have to have one day when you focus on what it means to be independent. And just as the 4th of July is so special to Americans as we became independent, the 5th of Iyar, Yom Ha'atzmaut, is an amazing time. And you will find in communities around the world, not just in Israel, that there will be major celebrations in every Jewish community. Trying to remember, I think we're doing Lake Eola this year because it's Israel's 70th anniversary. So usually the Federation hosts the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration at the JCC, but this year they want to go a little bigger. So they needed some more room. And I'm pretty sure it's Lake Eola this year. So check your emails for information on that. If you live in Israel, it's even specialer. That is to say, they do even more, of course, because it's their Independence Day right up there on that dirt. So they award the Israel Prize. This is a special award that's given to somebody in that year who has made the great contribution to Israeli life and culture. So this is where you'll get people who have had a lifetime of service to Israel, the country. They'll receive these rewards. You also will have an international Bible contest for high school students, which is a big deal. It's kind of cool that rather than having American Idol or having the Super Bowl, not to say that soccer isn't a big thing in Israel, and so is basketball, but we also have a Bible contest in Israel, and this is the day. The IDF, the Israeli military, also shows off much of their army, which, remember, is especially poignant in Israel because the people they are showing, the citizens of Israel, they have served in the army. So it's not like in America where a very small percentage of Americans are actually in the military. And so when you go to an American parade and they have soldiers, it's like, oh, look at them. In Israel, when you have the soldiers, it's look at us, right? The people watching and the people in the parade are really very much the same people. And many Israelis, of course, they go out. Right? They go out for picnics and outings and family time and just really have a great time together. Make sense? Pretty clear? It sounds like an Independence Day, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. In the conservative movement and in some other Jewish groups, we recognize that Israel's reestablishment is the, how did I phrase it? It is a blessing to all Jews and a step towards redemption. Right? We say in our prayers, Reshit Simchat Geulatenu. It's the beginning of the budding of our redemption. It's the images like of a flower. If you look on a tree like at this time, and there's just a tiny little bud, right? You know that without that bud, there will be no flower. And when you see that bud, you know, hey, there might be a flower, and if there's flower, there might be a fruit, and that might be what we're looking for. So we are very hopeful, right? It's our belief that the modern state of Israel is that Reshit. It's just that first budding of redemption. We're not expecting Mashiach to come walking through the door tomorrow. It'd be nice if it happened, but we do know that this is a precondition, that without this, it's not going to happen. Therefore, we change our service on the 5th of Iyar. We add prayers to reflect. We say the Al HaNisim with special words. You may remember the Al HaNisim is the paragraph that we also say on Purim, and we also say on Hanukkah. And we say a special version of that for Yom HaAtzmaut, for Israel's Independence Day. We do a special Torah reading from Deuteronomy, and we do a special reading from Isaiah for the Haftarah. And this way we mark the day not only as barbecue and parties and falafel and stuff, but we also mark it as being a religious celebration, that this is the hand of God in history, and something that we should appreciate in that way. Not everybody agrees. So there's a bit of a problem with Yom HaAtzmaut, which is that it's the 5th of Iyar. The 5th of Iyar means that it comes during the Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. And the counting of the Omer, you may remember, we talked just briefly about, is a period from the second day of Passover until the holiday of Shavuot. But in particular, during that time period, in the days of the Talmud, there was a great catastrophe among the students of Rabbi Akiva. And in order to remember that catastrophe, it's kind of a dialed down period of happiness. We don't do as much. We don't do weddings. We don't do celebrations. You don't trim your beard. You don't get your hair cut. Not a big problem for me. And so we wouldn't really normally schedule a big party during that time period. Usually, we can talk about that in more detail another time, because there's been some changes on how we view that, especially with Israel being independent again. So that means there are some people who are unhappy that Yom HaAtzmaut, this day of celebration, is happening during that time period. But even still, most have no problem celebrating it as a unique day, a unique celebration. And yes, 1,500 years ago, 1,700 years ago, Rabbi Akiva and his students had this problem, but we have this blessing, and we can't ignore this blessing just because of that problem. So, make sense-ish? Okay. The day before, the 4th of Iyar, we have Yom HaZikaron. Yom HaZikaron is the Remembrance Day. And the full official name, let's see if I can get this right, is Yom HaZikaron Lechalalei Me'acharot Yisrael V'Lanifkei Fulot Eva, which is the really, really long, fancy name, which means the day of remembrance of the Israeli fallen soldiers and the victims of terrorism. That's the official name. Now, originally, Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron were the same day. And so on the day of independence, when people, like the 4th of July here, people would also be visiting the graves of their loved ones. They would also be remembering their children that had died in the wars, or the people who've been killed by terrorists. And that was difficult, because you can imagine if you're remembering the price while you're also celebrating the gift, it created a very difficult situation. So in 1951, they decided that they would move Yom HaZikaron to the day before Yom HaAtzmaut. So Israel's Memorial Day, Israel's Remembrance Day, happens the day before their Independence Day. So imagine if in America we took Memorial Day and we moved it to July 3rd. And that gives you an idea of what the feeling is. And so there's a minute of silence that happens at 8 p.m. They do a siren all around the country, and everybody comes to a complete stop. You know, if you're driving in your car, you stop and you get out of your car and stand, even if you're on the freeway. And everyone does as well. And then on the next morning at 11, they do a 2-minute siren as well. So for 2 minutes, the entire country freezes in order to remember those who passed. And the day is a very powerful tribute. And of course, they do speeches and they do other forms of remembrance for all the soldiers that have died in that year and for all the wars in the past. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Did I skip one too many? No, I'm okay. All right. Which brings us to the third holiday, Yom HaShoah. Yom HaShoah is officially called, we have an official title, Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura, the day of remembrance for the Holocaust and heroism. But usually people just say Yom HaShoah, the day of the Holocaust. This is Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day. Oh, I realized I forgot to add something, sorry. Another Remembrance Day, but for difference. Right? So Yom HaZikaron is the Remembrance Day for the soldiers and victims of terror. And I should point out that in Orlando and most other Jewish communities around the world, we always will hold commemorative memorial ceremonies that we remember the fallen of Israel as well. So check the Federation calendar. It's obviously going to be the day before Israel's Independence Day celebration. And it's almost always at the JCC that we have that ceremony. So if you can go, it's important. Yom HaShoah is on the 27th of Nisan. We'll get back to why that was chosen. So on Yom HaShoah, it's the day when we remember the Holocaust and those who died in the Holocaust. It was established officially in 1953, so only a few years after Israel became a nation. Now, originally, the date was supposed to be the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Remember, I said in the official title, right, Gvura, which means heroism, the people who began the holiday wanted to make sure we remembered those who were murdered, but we also remembered those who fought back, that we remembered the partisans and the resistance and all of the people who fought against the Nazis. And so they wanted to pick a date that would symbolize that, because you can't pick a date when the most people died, pick a date when some other measure of when the Holocaust happened. The Holocaust happened for years. So there isn't like a particular day. And they didn't want to pick like the day they began the final solution. So they wanted to pick a day that represented our spirit of fighting against the Nazis. And so they wanted the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was the best known of the uprisings and the fights against the Germans by the Jewish resistance. There's a problem though, right? 1943, that was the 14th of Nisan. The 14th of Nisan is next week. It's called Passover.
It's my birthday.
Right. And you can't really have the sadness of the commemoration of the Holocaust be overlapping with the celebration of Passover. It doesn't work. The same way that Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut had to be separated so you could have them separately. You can't have Yom HaShoah be on Pesach. It's just not going to work. So, I mean, in case you're wondering, for the people who fought back against the Nazis, they chose that day on purpose because they wanted to show that they were willing to fight for their freedom the same way that we had to gain our freedom from the Egyptians. So that's why they picked the date when they would fight back. But it doesn't work for making a holiday. So instead, what they did is they moved it 8 days before Yom HaAtzmaut. So that's after Passover and before the Israel's Independence Day, but long enough before Israel's Independence Day that it doesn't give the wrong message, right? Israel didn't become a country because of the Holocaust. Israel was already being founded, as we talked about in our history classes. Israel was already being founded and already being rebuilt long before the Holocaust even became a thing. It wasn't even dreamed of. Nightmare. And so they didn't want people to think that it's Holocaust, Memorial Day, Independence Day, because that gives the wrong impression. They also didn't want to move it too far away from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, because they wanted people to remember the resistance, that, you know, the Jews didn't just die, that we did fight back, and we fought back hard. It's just, you know, France couldn't beat the Germans, and England barely held on. What do you expect, you know, the Jews to be able to do on our own? You know, even if you'd given us tanks and planes and guns, we still would have lost that fight, but we did fight back. So the 27th of Nisan was the date that was chosen to be that sort of compromise for Yom HaShoah. And there's a problem with that. Well, because the Jewish calendar, right? The traditional Jewish calendar says that the whole month of Nisan, from the beginning of Nisan all the way to the end of Nisan, is a day of celebration. Is a month of celebration. This is the month of our redemption. This is not a month when you are supposed to be sad. This is not a month when we say Tachanun during our prayers. This is a month of joy. Picking this day and putting it on that day caused a lot of controversy. I put that out of order. So let me back up a little bit. So the chief rabbi in 1949, which was earlier than when they picked that day for Yom HaShoah, he had said the 10th of Tevet was the appropriate day. That was the right day. Why? It was already a fast day. And that way people were already in a sad frame of mind, because we were remembering the siege of Jerusalem. And he wanted to tie the siege of Jerusalem to the siege of the Holocaust as being a unit. And he wanted to do it as well when it wasn't in Nisan, because he didn't want to step over the celebration of Nisan. Other rabbis who disagreed with him, because, you know, we're rabbis, we always argue, they suggested, how about if we just do it with the 9th of Av? Right? How about in Tisha B'Av? We've already got this day that is the saddest of our sad days. Let's just do it then. For most of us, we disagree that the Shoah, the Holocaust, was a unique and singular event, even though it lasted for many years, that especially for our generation, we need to be able to remember it distinctly. In 100 years, in 500 years, I don't know. Maybe we will be commemorating the Shoah on the Holocaust. On Tisha B'Av. Maybe we'll be doing it then. But for now, we need that separate day to be able to remember it more clearly and distinctly. And we can see that even with that special day, even with us being alive and helping to keep that memory alive, there are still many people who don't really remember it very well, and who not just have forgotten the lessons, but don't even remember the basic facts of the Holocaust. So keeping it as a separate moment, I think, is still very much the right idea. Backing up to what should have been the next slide. In Israel, the way Yom HaShoah is commemorated is at 10 a.m. The siren will wail for 2 minutes. Again, everything stops. And throughout the day, places of entertainment are legally closed. Right? So the government says, your movie theater, you're not open on Yom HaShoah. Right? Your disco, your nightclub, whatever, you're not open on Yom HaShoah. It is just lock the door and go do something else. TV stations and radio stations, they're not playing the usual pop music and other TV shows. You're not going to find the comedies on TV. Instead, there's going to be the ceremonies, various commemoration and remembrance ceremonies held by the government, and there are also going to be documentaries that are about it. Now, the radio can also play more low-key music that is there to help people reflect during that day. But the entire tone of the day changes during Yom HaShoah. So just, imagine the impact of turning on the radio or turning on the TV, and every channel, every station you go to is reminding you of the day. And that's one of the powerful things about it. Okay, now if I'm not mistaken, there we go. So the conservative movement, we agree that Yom HaShoah needs to be distinct. We include a special prayer in the Amidah. We also have a Yom HaShoah scroll. It's not a scroll, it's like a book that gives additional readings and additional reflections. We haven't created additional obligations on Yom HaShoah because we're always very reluctant to add new obligations to an individual. As a community, we can read, we can do things, but as an individual, we're not going to force everybody to fast or things like that. And many important commemorative and educational events take place on or near this day in communities around the world, including Orlando. Those are usually in Orlando. We cooperate with the Holocaust Center, the museum, and they are the ones who sort of set the calendar for that time so that we can come as a community to commemorate. Questions? Okay.
These are facts.
Well, these are facts, but
if you want to make it like a fast
Mhm.
a day as individual.
As an individual, you can always make that choice, right?
Okay.
But there is one other problem with fasting on Yom HaShoah. Right, when we fast on the 10th of Tevet or Tisha B'Av, we are making a statement that was taught to us by the prophets and was ratified by the people themselves afterwards, that as much as we blame the Babylonians and then for Tisha B'Av, the Romans and the Spaniards for the catastrophes that happened to us on those days, we also recognize that parts of those days were our fault, right? When we commemorate the golden calf, we're sad about the bad stuff that happened, but we're also saying we did that, right? When we mourn the destruction of the first temple, we say that the first temple was destroyed not because the Babylonians were so powerful, but because we had fallen apart. And part of the fast on Tisha B'Av, which is different than the fast of Yom Kippur, for example, is saying sorry, to say that we have to change what we were doing. Most authorities, myself absolutely included, are not at all of the belief that we caused the Holocaust. Right? So to fast as though we were sorry for the Holocaust, that we did something that made it happen, would almost be saying that maybe if we had behaved differently, then the Germans wouldn't have done it. And that's not a position that most people are willing to take. So it's not forbidden, but you have to have the right frame of mind. Welcome to Judaism. There's a lot of different opinions.
Why was suggested 10 of Tebet? Because Tebet is a hatred, the month of hatred or something like that?
Not specifically, no. It was because the idea of the siege of Jerusalem, when it became under attack, when the Babylonians surrounded the city, that was the most similar. And it was a day, the chief rabbi argued that it was a day that didn't already have a huge history around it. And so if we made that into a Yom HaShoah day, we wouldn't be pushing aside other, right? If you make Tisha B'Av the Yom HaShoah day, then you are kind of overshadowing the destruction of the temples and the expulsion from Spain and all the other catastrophes on that day. So it's tricky emotionally to find room to grieve, but not to drown in that grief. And so this was the solution that the State of Israel came up with, and which the communities around the world have agreed with, and we have followed. Again, the Israelis, they can't force us to commemorate Yom HaShoah when they do. They can't force us to commemorate Yom HaZikaron or Yom HaAtzmaut when they do. But as part of the unity that the Jewish people have, and as part of the unity that the State of Israel should give us, we do try to coincide our celebration or commemoration with theirs. Does that make sense?
So, Rabbi, from the 1948, you now recognize that's not a Independence Day for not Independence Day, the day Israel become a state, or they come to stay like, or they before that.
Right.
What's your position on the
Israel became a state on May 14th, 1948, 5th of Iyar. Right. That is the official date that's in their Declaration of Independence for the state of Israel. Right. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, right? That's always been there. Right. That became part of our people's heritage with Abraham. But just as there was, Abraham had the land, and then we ended up in Egypt, and then we came back and we celebrated when Joshua came back with the people. And then when the people left and went to Babylon, and then they came back, the people celebrated when they came back from Babylon and founded their new-ish government. Remember, we were still under Persian control. And then when the Maccabees were able to break free from the Seleucids, we had a whole new holiday of Hanukkah and an independent country, and we celebrated that. We celebrated 1948. What happened then? Right? It doesn't mean that it's not quite like, the United States, that there was nothing and then it existed. But we do have to recognize and celebrate this current version of the Jewish dream. Does that make sense? Right.
Now I got that clear.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, there's a long history.
It's
Again,
before 1948, it's Israel already.
Before 1948, it was Eretz Israel, which is
Israel, right?
No, before that it was called Palestine.
well,
Oh, really?
the land itself was called Palestine, because it was actually called a certain section of the Syrian, not the certain section of the Ottoman Empire, and then the British took it and they called it the Mandate of Palestine, and that covered both Israel and Jordan, what we call Israel and Jordan, but there wasn't any place that was sending, that was issuing money, that was issuing stamps, that had a passport that was called Israel or Palestine prior to 1948. Those were all, for hundreds and hundreds of years, that territory was controlled by other countries. And so this was the first time it was independent by itself, since back in, the Roman times. That was the last time that we had any sort of independence, was right before the Romans showed up. Thanks, you guys. But we have to remember, like we went over, we invited the Romans in. So it was, not we, the king and his brother were fighting, and they invited the Romans in. So it was our own fault. That's kind of why we also fast on Tisha B'Av, because it was the violence between the brothers that let the Romans take over. And so that's kind of our fault. But 1948 is the beginning of this version of the state of Israel, the government of Israel, this life of Israel.
In the secular calendar,
Mm-hmm.
but in the Jewish calendar, what day? What's the year? Do you remember?
Off the top of my head, I can't do the math. 5th of ER I remember very clearly, but the rest of the math is I'm a little fuzzy.
Okay.
So we're in 57. Oh no, here we go. 5778. I can do this math. Israel is 70 years old, so 5708. Yes, I can do that math. So my next trick, I'll do my taxes.
I'm sorry about that one.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You can put me on the spot for Jewish questions. Just don't put me on the spot for math questions. But yeah, so it's 5708 would have been the Jewish calendar. By the way, if you ever are wondering when the year was for something, at least within kind of modern history, you can find Hebrew date converters online, where you can put in the Hebrew date and then say, when was Passover 500 years ago? Wonderful website, HebCal. If you don't already know it, you should know it. I think I put it in the very first handout of the very first class, HebCal.com, HebCal. It's a great website because not only does it do date converting, it also does calendar for you, so you can find out when all of these holidays are going to be for the next 15 years, if you like. There are some interesting exceptions. We have a little bit of time, so I'll give you a little bit more that I didn't put in because it was complicated, but you guys are ahead of the curve. When Yom HaShoah, for example, falls on Shabbat, it has to be put off because we can't commemorate Yom HaShoah on Shabbat, right?
Nothing above Shabbat, right?
Right. Nothing is above Shabbat, exactly. So mourning practices are suspended on Shabbat, even for Shiva. The public mourning part of it. And this obviously is a very public, so it gets put off. Yom HaAtzmaut as well often has to be delayed if it's going to fall out on Shabbat for similar reasons, both because of the mourning of Yom HaZikaron and also because of the preparation that goes into doing it, and you don't want people preparing for that on Shabbat. So there are some special exceptions of where it gets moved depending upon where Shabbat is. That's why it's always good to use a good calendar. to make sure you've got it, because if the 5th Iyar is right on Shabbat or right after Shabbat, it's going to get bumped a little bit. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what I'm going to do now